Hello, everyone. Welcome to what will be, I guess, the May 13th replacement lecture for POLI 101 at Mesa College. Um, just a couple of reminders for my 9:30 a.m. class, who are the only ones who will be watching this probably. Um, we have class as normal on Wednesday, and I will take probably the first 25 or 30 minutes to answer any review questions that you have about the exam. Hopefully, we'll keep them mostly substantive. The final exam is going to be just like the two midterms, except doubled. So there will be two question boxes for you to answer, and each question box will contain 6 questions, and you have to choose 4 out of each 6. And so you answer a total of 8, 4 in each of the two question boxes, and you have double the amount of time to do this, so an hour and 10 minutes. And the class will not meet at all during finals week. There will be no replacement lectures. There's no class meetings, and this is per the syllabus. And the idea here is to give you time to do the reading. I'm sorry, not the reading, the final exam. No reading for that week. Apologies, misspoke. Okay, so for this week's class, to finish off, what we're going to work through here is sort of the opposite or the obverse of the lectures that we just had last week on democracy. We're going to be talking about dictatorships, autocratic practices, and how different types of um, different types of dictatorial regimes survive and fail. And so again, we're going to be looking at institutional choices that governments or rulers make, and how those institutional decisions, how the way they lay out the rules of the game affect outcomes. And in this case, what we're going to be looking at mostly is autocratic survival. What explains why some dictatorships succeed and others fail? Okay, so this first 2/3 of the lecture, that's what we're talking about, autocratic survival. We're going to go into autocratic death, the end of dictatorships, but I'll save all of that material for Wednesday's class. All right, so we'll start off with Schatz's soft authoritarianism, Central Asian transitions. This reading focuses in on comparing two countries, um, Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Akayev here is the leader of Kyrgyzstan. He's in the red, and this is Nursultan Nazarbayev, the leader of Kazakhstan, in blue. And the historical moment at which we find ourselves comparing these two countries is a pretty important one. In the early 2000s, a wave of revolutions swept through post-Soviet states that replaced relatively repressive pro-Russian regimes with new governments, or sometimes with new regimes. Remember the difference between a government and a regime. And these new regimes and new governments often favored openness and greater relations with the West. So they were distancing themselves from their post-Soviet institutional DNA. The presidents of many post-Soviet states after the collapse of the USSR were just the former regional heads of government under the USSR, or maybe their relations or their successors. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, the leaders of the Soviet states, in most cases, just continued on to become dictators or semi-authoritarian leaders of the post-Soviet successor states. Here's a picture from one of the target revolutions in the article. This is from Kyrgyzstan. Schatz compares the fates of the regimes in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan during this period. And as we'll see, Kyrgyzstan, the regime is replaced. The dictator is swept from power. Akayev loses power. Whereas in Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev manages to maintain his grasp on power. So I assume that these are not places that you know very well. But this is Kyrgyzstan. It's a small country in Central Asia that is sort of pinned between Kazakhstan and China. Here it is in the broader layout of Central Asia. Kyrgyzstan is mountainous. It's relatively undeveloped. It certainly looks very pretty. A few valleys, mostly high mountains. Kyrgyz is a language and an ethnicity entirely of its own. So this is a group. There's a group of people who consider themselves Kyrgyz, and the country Kyrgyzstan, the state in the former Soviet Union, was sort of set aside to allow for some amount of federalism where the Kyrgyz could govern themselves. About 75% of people in Kyrgyzstan are Kyrgyz, and they speak Kyrgyz as a language. About 75% of the people in Kyrgyzstan are Muslims as well, but the overlap between being Kyrgyz ethnic and being a Muslim is not 100%. There are some people who are Kyrgyz and non-Muslim. Kyrgyzstan is relatively poor. It has a GDP per capita of about $3,700 per person, which ranks them, something like 10 times poorer than the United States. Kazakhstan may be a little bit more familiar owing to its unfortunate association with Borat. Comparatively flat, there are some huge mountains in Kazakhstan, but Kazakhstan is a huge country. Mostly it's known for its vast hilly steppes. Think about the Mongol hordes coming across the vast steppe of Central Asia. We're talking about Kazakhstan now. Astana, the new capital, the sort of manufactured capital of Kazakhstan, looks really modern and oversaturated. It's everything sort of looks like a 1980s Miami Vice Instagram filter. Kazakh is also a language and also an ethnicity. 75% of people who live in Kazakhstan are Kazakhs, and if you are Kazakh, you are almost certainly Muslim, and about 75% of the population is Muslim as well. So here, if you're not a Muslim, you're probably not a Kazakh. And if you're not a Kazakh, you're probably not a Muslim. So the overlap here is much, much greater. Okay, so what is the variation that Schatz finds puzzling here? What is this paper about? So the main puzzle, obviously, what explains the survival of some regimes he refers to as soft authoritarian. Notice the distinction between hard authoritarian regimes. Hard authoritarian regimes, probably North Korea, Iraq under Saddam Hussein. These are places where the dictator is very openly a dictator. There's no attempt to hide the authoritarian roots or interests of the leader. In soft authoritarian regimes, there's usually an attempt to engage in some sort of liberal institution building, although as we'll see, Schatz argues that much of this attempt at liberal institution building is a sham. It's an attempt to lengthen the tenure of the dictator and trick the people into believing that they have some amount of institutional choice. More specifically, and we'll see why this is puzzling in a minute, Schatz wonders why Nazarbayev survived and Akayev failed to maintain power in Kyrgyzstan. And sort of again moving back to a more abstract question here. What sorts of policies, what institutions are good independent variables that help explain popular support for or fear of a dictatorship? Why do these institutional choices matter? What are they? Okay, a preview of the answer. So, what is the most important variable that helps explain authoritarian survival according to Schatz? Hopefully, from reading this paper, you manage to take some sense that what happens here is there's an ability to manipulate political discourse in the country, and that this ability, this instinct to manipulate discourse, the media, and the opposition is really the difference here. So how does this work in general? What could Nazarbayev do that Akayev failed at, and how did this skill preserve his power? Schatz isn't entirely clear on the mechanism here, but it seems that, in his words, controlling the narrative allowed Nazarbayev to sway people at the margins to his side and scatter the attention of the opposition. So what you don't want if you're a soft authoritarian is to have relatively few people on your side, and what you want even less is an opposition that's unified about your removal or about the reasons that you need to be removed or with whom you should be replaced. And so Schatz makes the argument that Nazarbayev was really good at manipulating opposition groups and media groups that allowed a splintering of his opposition. I might also ask what type of theory this is, what image. If we're focused mostly on Nazarbayev and Akayev's talents, here's a little bit of review for you. This would be a first image theory. And since Nazarbayev and Akayev are both concerned primarily with their survival in power, you might also classify this as a realist theory more than a political economic or a political sociological theory. Okay, so Schatz considers a handful of alternative answers here, reasons that we might think that some dictatorships survive and others fail. Some of them are influential. Uh, some of these explanations he thinks he can't control for, and they must have been influential in determining these two disparate outcomes. But a bunch of them he believes that he does control for. What is Schatz's major control strategy, and how does that help him control for some of these alternative theories? Okay, well, let's start off talking through the alternative theories really quickly, and then hopefully by the end of this discussion you'll get a sense for Schatz's control strategy, which I think is pretty clever. Okay, first, it's possible that a state's origins and institutions play a role in how autocrats can defend themselves. So in some places, maybe there are rules of the game that allow autocrats to defend themselves, parry against their opposition more effectively than in other places. And Schatz argues that some theories predict that the way in which states develop their DNA developed their institutions differently, and then the tools the autocrats have to use are different as well. So here you have a realist second image theory, right? Now it's about the institutions of the state, not about the talents of the person, that help explain the survival of the regime. And Schatz argues that he's controlled for this. How? Well, the origins of both the Kyrgyz and Kazakh states are the constitutions that they had under the USSR. And since these constitutions survived the breakup of the Soviet Union, they were more or less readopted. Schatz argues that the institutional content of these states is similar enough that we can sort of argue that it's controlled for. It should be puzzling to anyone who thinks that the origins or the history of a state or its government help explain disparate outcomes. They should look at the vast difference between what happens to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and be puzzled by the fact that there's a difference here, because you can't explain the variation between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan with the constant of their origins as successor states to Soviet regions. International interference. Maybe different foreign powers with different goals interfere in countries, and if they have different goals and the foreign powers are different and they interfere in different ways, some of them might support or undermine the autocrat in different ways, right? So now here, to review, again, we're talking about the survival of regimes. This is a realist theory, but now we're talking about relations between foreign powers and external variation that's external to the state that matters for explaining the differences in who survives and who fails. So this becomes a third image theory. Again, Schatz argues that Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, being Soviet successor states in Central Asia, in a place where the United States has had relatively little interest, helps control for this international interference. It was only Russia, and Russia had sort of a similar overarching goal to keep Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan in its orbit. Okay, a third theory, ethnic or religious background. So some theories predict that authoritarian regimes might fail where the balance of ethnicities is different, or where the culture is different. Some cultures are maybe just willing to accept autocracy, or maybe there are ethnic grievances or a sense that fighting an autocrat from a different tribe is worth it. Well, here, Schatz argues, because you have supermajorities of the titular ethnicity, Kyrgyz in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakh in Kazakhstan, Schatz argues that these are not compelling explanations either. So, there's nothing about the diversity of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan that should change things, and nothing about the culture offered by the dominant religion. Now, what might you say in response to Schatz's control strategy here? What hasn't he controlled for in terms of ethnic or religious background? Okay, hopefully, maybe you have realized that Kyrgyz and Kazakh are different ethnicities. They may practice different forms of Islam, and so the content of the culture in these places may be different, even though the amount of diversity and some of the other characteristics of the culture might be the same. So maybe this is something of a partial control. And then lastly, Schatz argues that some theories of civil conflict and the overthrow of autocrats argue that having a really forbidding geography makes it easier to hide. And here Schatz argues that the vast empty spaces of Kazakhstan and the mountainous terrain of Kyrgyzstan have both been shown to be advantageous for rebellion. And so, if both are advantageous for rebellion, this sort of geographic school of thinking tells us relatively little about the difference between Kyrgyz and Kazakh outcomes. And now, again, Schatz is sort of relying on us to buy the idea that the differences in the geography between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are minor. As long as they both favor rebellion, then we should be still puzzled by the differences in the outcome, and maybe we would quibble with that logic. So how is it that Schatz claims to control for all of these factors? Hopefully by now it's become obvious that both of these places are Central Asian post-Soviet republics, and so they have a lot of similarities to them. Since both states descend from Soviet institutions, and they kept most of those institutions, we think that the tools available to Akayev and Nazarbayev must be the same. Since both states are post-Soviet, the interference is likely to be the same. Maybe we'll see later that there are reasons to think that Russia might treat these two states differently, but we'll leave that aside for now. Both countries have the 75-25% split in ethnicities, and both countries are 75% Muslim. And here we have forbidding geography, but for totally different reasons, as we went into before. Okay, Schatz also acknowledges the influence of some other theories he can't control for. For example, timing. Kyrgyzstan experienced their revolt right after the other flower revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, and so it's possible that Akayev had very little time to react to the spreading of disenchantment with post-Soviet regimes, whereas the relatively late timing of the nascent rebellion in Kazakhstan gave Nazarbayev more time to prepare. So Schatz argues that this is possibly true. It likely has some influence on how these leaders reacted differentially. But as we'll see, Schatz provides evidence that Nazarbayev's strategy, his ruling strategy, he'd been laying the groundwork for this strategy for years and years. Having a little bit more time to respond had probably undermined the popularity and fear of his own rule to the point that he couldn't have done much about it, even if he had a little bit more advance notice. And secondly, Schatz makes some arguments about resources, right? Kazakhstan has vast natural gas resources, and Kyrgyzstan has few. So it's maybe true that these two countries aren't as directly comparable as Schatz claims that they are, but we'll see later that Schatz makes the argument that Akayev didn't use the resources he had. There are some resources, some ways for the government to get income in Kyrgyzstan, but Akayev didn't use them, and so having more probably wouldn't have helped him. Plus, he argues that there were other countries with fewer resources that are nearby that did survive the flower revolutions. For example, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan are even more resource poor than Kyrgyzstan, and their governments managed to survive the flower revolution. So it doesn't seem like resources helps explain the whole layout. Okay, so Schatz's theory about controlling the narrative. There are a handful of elements or expressions of controlling the narrative that Schatz argues are important theoretically. Okay, first, a committed core of support. Any dictator who wants to survive needs a committed core of supporters who believe that dictator's rule is either just or it is the best for their own self-interest to have that ruler maintain power. Second, you need subtle use of blackmail and enticements. Now notice, there's some trouble here. The standard is subjective. There's no way to know, I suppose, objectively whether a ruler is using subtle blackmail or subtle enticements as opposed to ham-fisted versions. But shots will provide us with some information that is intended to make us believe that Akayev was particularly clumsy and Nazarbayev was particularly subtle. Rationed use of coercion, again, a subjective standard, but Schatz is going to argue that sort of this out and out bulldoze the city kind of coercion, where you throw everyone who opposes you into prison, is a very bad way to run a country, and that you, countries are better off using coercion only as last resort. Fourth, you want to have a state-run media with broad reach and regulatory advantages, but you also want that state media to sell plausible propaganda. And so the difference between plausible and implausible propaganda is going to become very important to Schatz's theory. And then lastly, control of discursive moments in politics. Now this is very, um, very subjective and very vague. But what Schatz is talking about here is the ability of governments to choose or to choose or shape what the nation is talking about, right? So if you have multiple things in your news cycle, is the government a power player in terms of choosing which thing the population is most focused on? Okay, so we can fill in the hypotheses here, right? If these are the things that we believe a government should have in order to maintain power, in order to maintain control of the narrative, we might believe ahead of time that any place that we see a committed core of support for the dictator is more likely to survive a challenge to authoritarian power than a place that lacks, where the dictator lacks that core of committed support. We would also predict that the subtlety of the use of blackmail should predict whether or not an authoritarian regime survives. We should predict that places that do not ration their use of coercion are more likely to fail than those where the autocrat does ration their use of coercion. Where propaganda is believable, those places should be more likely to succeed, and where the autocratic government has control of discursive moments should be more likely to succeed. So now we can go through and we can ask the extent to which there is evidence of each of these elements in Kazakhstan versus Kyrgyzstan. And so we've set up a comparative research design here. Okay, so with respect to the committed core of support, we should expect to find that Nazarbayev has a committed core of support and Akayev does not. Okay, what does the evidence tell us from Schatz's theory? First, we saw that there were student mobilizations in Kazakhstan in favor of Nazarbayev. Now, when we think about the places like the nuclei for rebellion against the government, it is oftentimes the students that lead the rebellion. That's interesting, right? So the students are mobilizing in favor of Nazarbayev. This is taken by Schatz as a piece of very informative evidence, suggests that Nazarbayev has a real following. Another thing that Schatz notices that we might think a little bit cynically about today is that online portals, the precursors of your Facebooks and your Twitters, were swamped with pro-government comments. Lots and lots of people were commenting on newspaper articles talking about how much they love Nazarbayev. Now, in this day and age, we might be suspicious of this sort of behavior, right? We might think to ourselves, oh, these are just Russian trolls attempting to convince me this, that, or the next thing. Who knows if the people behind these egg avatar Twitters or sort of nameless but supposedly grassroots Facebook groups are really Americans or really Kazakhs or really Kyrgyz who are agitating for some issue or another. But at the time that Schatz is writing and doing his research, at the time that these rebellions are occurring, this idea of trolling is super new. So Schatz doesn't even think about it, right? It doesn't occur to him that these could be fake. If I recall, he doesn't think that these could be fake, but there might be reasons to think that they probably aren't, because we weren't that sophisticated in terms of using online portals to manage people's public opinion as we are today. In Kyrgyzstan, by contrast, the few independent polls that were ever taken in Kyrgyzstan show that there's low support. The governance in Kyrgyzstan is particularly bad. Another piece of evidence that Schatz uses to demonstrate that Akayev probably did not have a broad base of committed support is that he put his children in positions of power as opposed to rivals that needed buy-offs. And we'll talk about this much more over the course of this article, and even more when we get to Lisa Blades' article in a few minutes. But one of the ways that you increase your base of support as an autocrat is by identifying demographics or families that might challenge your rule and empowering them into positions that are neutered from their ability to actually threaten your rule, but have some amount of power or opportunity for profit uh, that entices those people to remain loyal to your government. And Kyrgyzstan, Akayev in Kyrgyzstan broadly failed to do this, so we would be surprised if he had a committed core of support. Second, we should see some evidence that Kazakhstan engages in a subtle use of blackmail and enticements, where Kyrgyzstan is much, much more overt. Evidence for this. When the students did become unruly in Kazakhstan, when there were students who agitated against the government, it was only then that Nazarbayev decided to buy them off. Another thing that Nazarbayev did in Kazakhstan that Schatz thinks is particularly brilliant is he recognized that there were very powerful agricultural firms that the government subsidized so that they were more competitive on the international market. Those firms had a lot of control over the political leanings of their employees. These firms, a lot of Kazakhstan is dominated by company towns, essentially, if you've heard that term before. These agricultural firms essentially run all the services in the towns. They even run the voting. And so what Nazarbayev did was, behind closed doors, threatened the heads of these agricultural firms and said, if the returns in the vote from the company towns isn't in favor of me, I'm going to cut your subsidies. And you'll end up losing in comparison to international firms and losing in comparison to the big agricultural firms that continue to support me. So rather than use violence in rural areas, Nazarbayev passes the buck. And so when there needs to be some amount of violence, it's the agricultural firms that are doing it, and they look like the bad guys, not the Kazakh regime, right? So this sort of selective or subtle use of blackmail or enticement is apparent to Schatz in Kazakhstan. It's not apparent in Kyrgyzstan. The big example that Schatz uses is the Marine base lease in Kyrgyzstan. The United States has leased a Marine base in Kyrgyzstan for a number of years, I think probably since the year after the Soviet Union collapsed. That base was not particularly important. Weird. That base was not particularly important to the Americans until we started the war in Afghanistan. And as it happened, the lease on that base in Kyrgyzstan came due right after the war in Afghanistan started. Nazarbayev here has an opportunity to crank up the rent. Cranks up the rent on the Marine base, and then he's capable of using that income to buy off an ever-widening circle of potential adversaries, right? But he fails to do so. Instead, he maintains the terms of the lease at about the same amount of money, and it becomes an open secret that he takes that money personally, distributes it to his family, and moves it overseas. So this is the moment at which Schatz argues that a Kyrgyzstan with a better resource endowment, with natural gas or with oil, probably Akayev would have failed to take the opportunity to spread those resources around in a way that would have reinforced his power. Instead, what we should expect, since he failed so miserably with respect to the Marine base lease, is that he would have failed in similar ways with respect to the to any other resource that Kyrgyzstan might have had. Okay, how about the rationed use of coercion? This is sort of a similar set of evidence here between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. We should expect, because Kazakhstan or the Kazakh regime, Nazarbayev, survived, that Kazakhstan will use coercion in a more rationed way than Kyrgyzstan. And in fact, that this is what we find, right? Schatz details stories of rivals who actually threatened Nazarbayev's power in some region, who were promised leniency if they left politics. They were given jobs, cherry jobs representing Kazakhstan's mission to France or mission to the United States, which allowed Nazarbayev to buy off some of the people that might have otherwise been his rivals, as opposed to just punishing them. So he's bribing anyone who's susceptible, as opposed to using physical punishment. This is not the case in Kyrgyzstan. In fact, the vast majority of people who politically opposed Akayev were thrown in jail or exiled from the country, or in some cases even killed. And not only does this make a lot of enemies, but it makes Akayev look like a hypocrite. Akayev promised in the post-Soviet era to bring liberal openness to Kyrgyzstan. And after making that promise, he then cracks down on political opposition. He engages in a lot of use of coercion, and this makes him look like a hypocrite. Schatz notes that Nazarbayev never made this promise. He never made a promise to liberalize, and so it was very difficult to use the moments of coercion in Kazakhstan against Nazarbayev to argue that he had been a promise breaker. Okay, control of the state media. In Kazakhstan, the state media generated plausible propaganda, and there was very little punishment that was leveraged against independent media. So Nazarbayev seems a lot more savvy about picking alternative stories for the state media. For example, they pulled in Russian observers to certify the election in Kazakhstan instead of creating a giant conspiracy theory. So in some places, if the government if the government appears to be fixing an election, the story gets out, people broadly know that it's a problem, and the government has to create some giant conspiracy theory about how all of these people are lying about how the election was fixed. Instead, Schatz argues that Nazarbayev did an end around on this by bringing in corrupt Russian observers to appear on state media to say that they were credible third parties who certify the election. A second thing that Kazakhstan did was they only punished individual independent journalists occasionally. Usually, they harassed independent media outlets with higher taxes or disparate regulatory enforcement, and this provided special advantages to the state media. The state media was capable of reaching a much wider broadcast audience. They had much snazzier graphics and better shows and all of these sorts of things. And it was really because the state was taking little chunks out of the independent media that didn't look like repression. No one was ending up in jail. So this difference, again, was important to Schatz's theory. In Kyrgyzstan, on the other hand, Kyrgyzstan was one of the places that jailed journalists the most often. They closed entire newspapers, and this is again despite the fact that they had promised to have a liberal regime. Okay, discursive moments. Here we expect that Nazarbayev will be able to flip the script, take control of what the people are talking about in ways that Akayev will never touch. And here we have a really, really rich set of evidence on the Kazakh side. One thing that was really, really clever is that Nazarbayev used to encourage his legislature to write up really oppressive, draconian laws that would just crack down on independent media or opposition parties. And then the legislature would pass these laws and they would go up to Nazarbayev to sign, and he would veto them, and he'd give some big speech talking about how it's important to have independent voices or opposition, and he would castigate the members of his own party who thought that they were protecting him, and he said, I don't need protecting, these sorts of things. So it looked like Nazarbayev was standing guard against further authoritarian creep. He was actually sort of the good guy, right? Another thing that Nazarbayev did that Schatz finds clever is he banned a number of small opposition parties, a number of potent but small opposition parties, made the argument that the number of opposition parties was actually making it harder for the democratic public to unseat him. And so what he was doing by canceling out some of the smaller parties and leaving the rest was making it easier for people to consolidate behind an alternative to himself. But of course, he very strategically took out the strongest parties and the strongest leaders and left the weakest remaining. Another thing that he did was admitted to limited amounts of corruption, right? He would allow independent media to find out and report on certain instances of corruption. He would make a big show of firing the people whose corruption was so ostentatious that they got caught. And even when he was caught, he would say things like, yeah, listen, I'm partly on the take here. I'm the president. What do you think is going to happen? And this is how the world works. There's always corruption. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. They're hiding bigger corruption. So occasionally we get caught and you get to see what we're really doing. And as long as it's not so bad, maybe the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And the last thing is that Nazarbayev was a real pioneer of the idea of fake news. He made it sound like a lot of what the independent journalists were saying was just smear campaigns, yellow journalism, sensationalism to sell papers. And he had this credible propaganda wing in his state-run media that allowed him to fill the airwaves with alternative takes on the same news and drown out any sorts of scandals that would be too big for him to manage in these, using these other techniques. Kyrgyzstan, we saw a lot of direct conflict with media groups. Essentially, Kyrgyzstan never attempted, or Akayev in Kyrgyzstan never attempted to manage his public image and instead relied more on his brute power. Okay, so questions for discussion that might help you review for an exam question on Schatz. Are you convinced by Schatz's explanation? Do you think that his strategy for controlling for alternative explanations is a sound one? Why or why not? And this is supposed to force you into thinking about what the alternative theories that he controlled for are and how his selection of the cases of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan does a lot of that labor for him. Second question, do you recognize any of these techniques that work in the United States today? What are the actual effects of discursive techniques on public discussion of real politics? Take what Schatz is saying about controlling the narrative in the media, take what he says about being disingenuous at some moments and ask yourself, is this something that you see in the world today? Okay, now we'll move on to our second reading for this week. Lisa Blades on Egypt, autocratic elections and how they help manage elite rivalries. Here a little bit of context about Egypt. This is a photo of Hosni Mubarak. He's seated next to Anwar Sadat. Anwar Sadat is on the right and Mubarak is on the left. At the time of the photo, Anwar Sadat was the president of Egypt. In 1981, Sadat was assassinated by members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, a prominent Islamist group at the time. Following the assassination, Mubarak served as president until 2011. Mubarak's presidency at first stood for regular referenda, approval of the people to see how many people approved of his rule, and the tallies during these votes showed greater than 90% support for his administration. In 2005, he stood for the first multi-party elections of his presidency, and official returns, those certified by the Egyptian state, gave him 88.6% of the vote. All in all, Egypt's National Democratic Party ruled through Anwar Sadat or Hosni Mubarak for about 40 years, and if one includes the prior incarnation of the party under Gamal, the ruler previous to Anwar Sadat, almost 70. According to Freedom House, one of those organizations that created a measurement of democracy that we've discussed in past weeks, the Egyptian political system was basically designed, the institutions of the system were basically designed to keep the NDP in power. The People's Assembly of Egypt had the constitutional authority to check the president's power, but under Mubarak they functioned essentially as a rubber stamp. Nearly all of the legislation passed by the People's Assembly was initiated by or authored by the president's office, and using the People's Assembly as a rubber stamp, Mubarak maintained an official state of emergency that allowed him to ban demonstrations and jail political opponents at will. So he used this sort of legislature as a way to maintain his power. Despite the clampdown on civil rights and the neutering of the parliament, Mubarak allowed for multi-party democracy in the legislature, including candidates from the WFAD, the National Accord Party, the Democratic Front, and for a time, running as independents, members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Opposition strength in the parliament ranged from about 5% of elected legislators to about 20% over the terms of Mubarak's presidency. Now, of course, we know how this all ends, right? But there are still some important questions here. The NDP is one of these really long ruling single party regimes, much like the PRI in Mexico and the People's Action Party in Singapore, who we talked about last week. Um, Many other parties like it have maintained power for a really long time, and during that time, they held elections. The PRI was particularly famous for this. Their elections were seen as fair in the way that they were held, and yet the PRI never lost, and they were seen broadly as an authoritarian party. So part of the reason Blades' book is worth reading, even though Mubarak fell within a year of her publishing it, is because it lays out an important answer to a really interesting puzzle. In what ways do these fixed elections for meaningless offices meet the interests of all of the participants, the president, the elites, and the people? So let's lay Blades' puzzle out a little bit more here. Uh, what does the dictator risk by holding an election? Right? Obviously, it's possible that the election doesn't go your way, and then you have to risk looking anti-democratic and unpopular. So there must be some incentive to take these risks. What does it provide to the autocrat? Second, why do elites risk contesting an election that they know is rigged? What do they get if they win that's worth competing for? And then lastly, why do ordinary people stand in line to vote for an election that has absolutely no consequence on the policy that the government is going to return? What's in it for the people? Blades looks briefly at some other reasons for having elections, some of which we've seen before, and they ask if they seem to match what we have observed in Egypt. And you might also ask whether they match what we have observed in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. Olson and Geddes, remember our friend Olson, argue that elections allow for elite competition that prevents civil violence. They determine who dominates at mobilizing voters. Does this seem to match Egypt? Not if you believe the context that I just laid out, right? The winner is never in doubt. It's always going to be Mubarak. And no one would beat Mubarak at a civil war, so there's very little reason to have these elections in the first place. There's only one elite that matters, and that elite is Sadat or Mubarak. Tilly, we've seen Tilly before too, right? Maybe elections among autocrats are meant to generate some amount of accountability between the stationary bandit and the groups that are paying taxes to it. Does this seem to match with Egypt? Well, again, probably not, because it doesn't seem to create any accountability for the NDP to have these elections in the first place. And then lastly, Blades argues that some people claim that what having an election does is actually about international signaling, right? The donor states and NGOs that provide aid to certain countries require that there are plausible elections so that they can provide that aid. Does this work in Egypt? Maybe. Maybe if you think that the Americans and the other people providing Egypt with military and other sorts of aid might use these elections as cynical, plausible deniability, but is anyone really fooled? 90% in multi-party elections? Of course Mubarak is fixing these things, so it doesn't really seem to fit in Egypt either. Okay, so what is the answer? In order to understand this, we need to go back to our game theory lecture and think about a version of a game that we have seen before called the Dictator's Dilemma. Most of you are probably too young to recognize this guy. His sort of nom de guerre was Comical Ali. He was the information minister um, of Iraq during the Second Gulf War. He was famous for getting on Iraqi television and claiming that the Iraqi army was beating back the Americans, even though it was obvious to everyone that such was not happening. In fact, in his last broadcast, right after this screenshot is taken, he makes the claim that the Americans are being driven out, and you can see the American tanks starting to plow through the defenses in the background. If no one was fooled by Comical Ali's ridiculous lies on television, why was he telling them? Who was he lying to? Uh, The theory is that he was lying to Saddam, right? He would go on international programs and claim that the Iraqis were beating back the Americans because no one in the Iraqi army wanted to tell Saddam Hussein the truth about what was happening. So let's make this just a little bit more formal and a little bit more abstract. Let's say that you are a dictator. At some point, a rival who knows some population better than you will approach you with some story about why you need their help. Of course, your rival is going to want something for this service. They're going to ask you for power. They're going to ask you for influence. They're going to ask you for money. This is going to cost you. It's going to erode how much you can pull out of the state, or it's going to upset the balance of power that you've carefully maintained that allows you to stay in power to the next round. But now you have to decide what you want to do. Are the Mer people restless? Are they going to cause trouble? Do you really need the help of Merman? What's the challenge in picking this strategy? What problem or game are you faced with? It's an informational asymmetry. Merman has an incentive to tell Skeletor a lie in order to get paid for doing nothing. So let's look at some of the idealized payoffs here in this game. If Merman is telling the truth and Skeletor pays him, Skeletor gets the revolt handled and he identifies a new right-hand man. This is a good Pareto optimal equilibrium in this game. If Merman is lying, Skeletor pays without needing to, and maybe in a way that erodes his ability to maintain his own power. Maybe it gets Merman closer to a real takeover. This is a very bad outcome for Skeletor. Here, where Merman is telling the truth and Skeletor passes, Skeletor faces a real possibility that the fish folk are going to revolt, and he's lost the help of the most powerful person capable of handling that rebellion. Here, of course, Merman goes home empty-handed, and nothing really happens. There's no Carfax to help Skeletor manage this problem. But he does have advisors, right? Maybe there are other people who could help him out. But there's still a problem. First, Beastman doesn't speak fishfolk, so his info is probably not as good as Merman's. And second, Beast has an incentive to lie to Skeletor too. He has the incentive to lie to Skeletor and tell him that Merman is lying. That preserves his own influence. He doesn't anger Skeletor. Maybe Beastman was paid in the first place to keep rivals away, and the fact that Merman has this nascent fishfolk rebellion on his hands means that Beastman failed. So Blades argues that this is a real problem for autocrats, and it's a problem that helps us understand why we have elections. So we return to the question, what does the dictator get out of an election? Well, one thing they get is information about elites. What do we mean? What information? What information does the dictator get from the election? First, the dictator learns which of the elites are capable of mobilizing mass support. This sort of follows Olson's logic about civil conflict in a way. So notice what we've done. We've made some assumptions about what dictators want, which is survival, and we've created a basic model out of one of the challenges they might face to achieve it, an informational asymmetry. From these things, from these assumptions, that dictators want survival and that they face an informational asymmetry in maintaining it, we've used a theory of the state, Olson, to adapt an expectation of what might vary. Second image state institutions. This helps explain the outcome. Where we have elections, dictators learn which elites are capable of mobilizing mass support. Where we have no elections, the dictator fails to learn the same thing. Okay. It also provides the dictator or the president with a mechanism for elite capture. How does the dictator continue to profit from these elections after they've happened? Well, you can buy off the elite with special privileges. In the case of Egypt, Blades shows us that there's no penalties for corruption. And so one of the first things you do if you're elected through the NDP to the legislature, you start engaging in massive corruption to enrich your family. You also get goodies to hand out to your constituents, right? And so the dictator is capable of locking in elites by providing these services or opportunities to services from them. Blades doesn't spend much time on this particular trade-off here in the chapter that I assigned, But notice that there are different risks to using each reaction to a rising elite, right? If you buy the elite off, you create credibility and legitimacy for a challenge from the inside, right? If you buy the elite off and you bring them into the government, then those people have a megaphone, they have a voice, they have a way to influence policy, however subtle, and maybe the rebellion you're going to face is from the inside. But if you jail them or ignore them, you don't bring them into power, now there's a grievance that fuels rebellion from below. Notice how much this choice looks like Shots, right? Which choice does Shots think is the most dangerous? Plainly, it's ignoring your rivals, right? This is what Akayev did wrong. He failed to buy these people off. Instead, he clamped down. Blades is making a similar argument here. Elections help the dictator choose which people they need to buy off and who they are safe jailing or ignoring. Okay, so this is how elections solve this problem, right? You get information about mass preferences as well as information about elite capabilities. If you have information about mass preferences, you can create policy that helps mitigate people's anger. You can get a closer assessment of elite client linkage so you know which elites are capable of mobilizing lots of people. If the block is strong, it's probably better to appease. Otherwise, there are strategies to split the elites from the masses, right? So, how does this function in reality, right? If we fixed the election, how do we get these? How do we get this information about the mass preferences? Well, of course, the state knows what the real election returns were. They know how much the vote was fixed by, and therefore they can look and see the residual, what's left over and who is actually capable of buying this sort of support. Again, you actually don't have the same dilemma here when it comes to buying off the masses. If you buy off the masses, they're probably just happy. You don't create any sort of masses that are likely to revolt against you from the inside. But if you repress masses that are important, it generates the grievance that fuels the rebellion from below. So again, what you really want to know is whether there is an elite mass connection that allows you to, or encourages you or incentivizes you to buy off, to buy those populations off. Okay, so now that we've talked about what the dictator gets out of an election, what does the elite get out of an election? Why would you participate in an election that provides you very little in the way of national power? Well, the first reason Blades argues that you might participate in an election is that it signals to the autocrat that you can deliver or withhold supporters and threaten their interests. Right? You need to buy me off because I'm capable of winning an election. Second, it offers a signal to your supporters. If you win the election, it tells your supporters that you can deliver benefits and your rivals can't. Right? You need to maintain your clientelistic relationship to me. You need to provide me with the volunteer work and the undying affection, etc., etc. Otherwise, you're not going to continue to get these goodies. Lastly, it sends a signal to your rivals, right? I win these elections. I am the one that's capable of managing politics at the local level here. You should find a new sandbox to play in. Okay, so if those are the reasons the elites might play, what are the reasons that the masses might vote? Probably you're getting used to this idea so far, right? It's a signal to the autocrat. Our interests are synced enough that we can punish a dictator that ignores us. So you go to the polls, you vote your conscience, knowing that the votes aren't going to be counted honestly because you want the autocrat to know that you are powerful enough. Okay, here is a great slide for reviewing for the final. It lays out the give and take between all of the three major types of parties in Blades' model. In sum, what we're getting here is that these elections, even when they're fixed, provide information about who's really powerful in society that smooths the running of power and the distribution of benefits from the government. Discussion questions. Are there things that Blades missed? Do you think that there are signals that we didn't describe in this lecture? And then second, are you convinced by Blades' explanation? What are the strengths and weaknesses of her argument? Okay, that is all I have for you today. I will see you all on Wednesday when we will talk through Geddes' Geddes' work on autocratic decline, and I will take any questions that you have about the final.